Wow, what a great event you've got planned today. Just talking to the previous speakers and also talking to some of the speakers that you're going to be hearing from today, you have got a truly exciting event, and I'm really, really pleased that I'm part of it today as well. This morning, much to the frustration of conference organisers, I was writing my speech because I was struggling to really understand what's the best thing to actually support you in this conversation. So I wanted to start with my last slide. So this is the last slide of my slide deck, but it's a pretty damn good first slide as well, because I think it embraces what we're all talking about at the moment, which is about the global trends in terms of where we're seeing a change in terms of sustainability. And I think this quote from the Financial Times really summarises very, very well the organisations that understand what true sustainability means are those organisations which will succeed. Those organisations that don't understand about the economic, the social and environmental imperatives are organisations that won't necessarily actually grow as businesses. So I thought that's a great slide to finish with, but a great slide to start with as well. I'm probably not going to be the best role model in terms of the amount of slides I've got to show you. I've got about 50 slides in about 30 minutes, but to give it a bit of structure, what I wanted to talk about are those main four ingredients. So how do we make sure that the direction that green buildings and certification is taking has certainty to it? How do we make sure the assessment methodologies are really driving performance? How do we make sure that we cover the life cycle of the built environment? Importantly for investors in the room and those who basically are occupiers, how do we make sure that we're driving value? Because this isn't about putting badges on buildings, this is making sure that we have sustainability which creates real value either to the occupants or to investors. And how do we make sure we share knowledge? And I think today is a really good example of how we actually make sure we share knowledge between organisations and how we can form bridges and links. And I know a large number of those links exist already between organisations and between. But how do we actually make sure we create that knowledge economy? What I want to add to that as well, which is the real subject I was thrown at in terms of talking to you today, is so what are the big trends? What are the things that we need to be mindful of? Because certification of buildings won't be successful if they look back and are just about looking at current trends in terms of energy, water and waste. We need to look at the long-term mega trends. We need to understand what are the trends which are shaping society. So that's where I really want to start in the next sort of few minutes. I was trying to capture yesterday what I saw to be the 10 key trends which are actually shaping the built environment. And actually, whichever way you look at that list of 10 issues, they affect every aspect of the built environment. So whether it's sort of demographics, and I was looking at the World Health Organization report recently, by 2050, in Europe in particular, 51% will be over 65. So we're seeing an age of demographics. We need to make sure that buildings that we're constructing today are suitable for people to live in longer in terms of their needs and in terms of their mobility. If we look at what's happening in some of our world cities, China is a really good example. We're seeing large mass urbanisation. We're seeing cities being created which have densities of millions of people. We need to understand how we actually make those cities work in terms of transportation. How do we make sure that we don't get cities that become so cluttered and so difficult to move around that don't become workable cities? Looking at COP21, which is sort of happening as we speak and moving on into December, what are going to be the targets that developed and undeveloped countries tackle in terms of actually trying to look at climate change mitigation? What's the carbon limits that we're going to start in place which will drive this agenda even further? And in that same breath, how do we build our buildings, our cities, which are resilient to the future changes that we're expecting? The changes in weather, the changes in terms of temperature. How do we make sure that if we're building, constructing infrastructure buildings or communities now, that they are going to be suitable in the life that they're expecting to survive in the next few years? How do we make them all resilient? I was in Sao Paulo last week, And when they talk about pure poverty there, they're not talking about heated buildings, they're talking about making buildings cool because the temperature extremes are much more significant. How do we make sure that we as society can actually heat and cool our buildings? And this goes on. I think what becomes interesting now is we start to look at things such as technology integration and communication. We start to see some of that agenda conflicting. So we're starting to build our buildings and we're starting to put insulation panels, silver-backed insulation panels into our buildings, which are great in terms of new values in insulation, but are terrible in terms of making sure that we can actually allow connectivity in our houses. And if we're going to allow things like telemedicine to take place in terms of connecting us as human beings in terms of treatment at home, we need to actually understand how we can come to some of those conflicts. The last point, I think, is the one I really wanted to leave with you on that slide in particular, is every one of those risks, every one of those opportunities is a business opportunity for us to grab. So as we start to look at the design of buildings and the technologies and the materials that we need to insert into our buildings and we need to start to think about, there are opportunities for us, the construction industry, to do something different. And then when we start to look at the numbers, this is some numbers I stole from the World Bank this morning in terms of looking at some of those global trends. But the numbers are ginormous in terms of the risk, in terms of environmental consequences. And that's why I think when we start to talk about driving change, looking at change, the corporate world starts to understand more and more that when we talk about the environmental imperatives, this is all about good business now. This isn't about trying to look to see to be green or to do greenwash. These are economic decisions that businesses are making because they know they need to respond. And in that conversation, in terms of driving change, I think there's four main actors here which we need to make sure that certification systems and standards that we break really influence this agenda. It's about talking to organisations, it's talking about corporates. It's about making sure that we make good business decisions we can support investors. It's about providing good policy advice, as we've heard already today, that actually part of the role of Green Building Council is to support and challenge government in terms of the best way to drive policy, making sure we're making good economic decisions and good policy decisions, but making sure we make that information based on good research. So just looking at this through the lens of some of those actors on the stage, I suppose, it's about making sure, from a company perspective, we give competitive advantages. We're making sure that we really are looking at supply chains that are much more resilient and much more effective. Just to throw you a couple of examples, we did a lot of work on this in the Olympics. We were heavily involved in the Olympics in 2012 in London. And we pushed the supply chain much, much further than we thought they'd ever go. They resisted that change, but equally what they did is they created new products and services, and which have now give each one of those companies involved in that program a competitive advantage. By pushing the industry harder and faster, you give them a competitive advantage. Looking at things like supply chain resilience, making sure that we can actually understand what that looks like in terms of the future. Making sure that we bring the consumer into this conversation. I think when we start to look at rating tools and certification of consumers being outside the sector, what we need to do more is this conversation needs to have the consumers part of it. And for the first time, what we've done is we've actually written a standard which is orientated to the domestic consumers. So when they buy a property, they understand the benefits they get from buying a good building from the consumer perspective. This isn't about the developer badging the development as being good. It's about consumers saying, I can save energy, I can save water, the health and well-being of this building is better for me than the building. And making sure that we can attract investors. Looking at this issue about investors again, we've done a lot of work in terms of looking at fiscal measures in terms of making sure when it comes to the development of capitals that we can actually use things such as climate bonds or green bonds to drive this agenda in terms of change. But this goes on when you start to look at kind of investors in terms of how do we make sure that investors really understand this narrative, this conversation about how can sustainability, how can green buildings really support it? I think there again it's about making sure that we start to have these conversations much more actively. This isn't about just influencing developers and architects, this is about making sure that this conversation is rounded in terms of all those actors that I mentioned before. There again, one of the things that we at BRE, and we've done a lot of work ourselves on, is working in this policy space. When we start to look at what rating tools do, it is about best practice. It's about going ahead of the curve in terms of current practice. And that then supports government to understand how elastic the market can be, how elastic developers can be in terms of current best practice. And so what we do a lot of work on is we feed the information back from our rating tools, not just in terms of the UK, but other countries as well, to demonstrate what can be achieved. And sometimes what maybe needs to be done in terms of supporting that process. So maybe fiscal measures. So if certain technologies are not ripe enough in the market, what fiscal measures to support the more kind of wider adoption of that technology. So that feedback loop between those who are driving change and what that mass market looks like is important. So that was looking at that sort of group, that quartet of organisations. What I wanted to share with you as well is what about the next generation? So this slide is a survey which was undertaken quite recently, looking at future trends in terms of the next generation. The kids are some of the people in this room, and it becomes quite interesting in terms of some of their choices. Some of the choices of people who are at university and at school nowadays are looking at organisations very, very closely, because when they're looking at their careers, when they're looking at where they want to buy from, they are looking at the organisations that have strong corporate identities, strong corporate ethics in terms of what they're trying to do. So as we start to look at these trends, I think that was quite a useful survey to put into that mix to say that, you know, lots of people in this room understand some of these trends, but it's also the next generation who are actually very, very clued in terms of what's going on. So what does that mean to us in terms of rating tools? So as far as rating tools are concerned, there is a fascinating space that is emerging between voluntary standards, which is what rating tools are about, and the regulatory base. So in some countries, we're starting to see a conversation about what's the best driver here. Is it to regulate harder to make sure that effectively we're pushing the industry through regulation? Or is it about giving free space to the industry to demonstrate they can do the best they can through the use of voluntary standards? And if we get those voluntary standards right, like Britain, or other rating tools as well, then effectively what we can do is we can actually have a much more nimble market because it's not dependent on regulation. It's about demonstrating market transformation. If we're going to improve our buildings, we need to continue to improve. This isn't about staying static. The construction industry is moving forward. It's moving forward quicker now than it has for many, many years. But we need to actually make sure that market transformation increases in pace. We need to uncouple, and we need to kind of break this misconception that high quality equals high cost. And I've got some research which I'm going to share with you in a few minutes as well, is to try and actually break that myth, because if we are driving performance, we don't want to see this as an exclusive club that you can only have high quality buildings if you pay a higher price. We actually need to make that more mass market. We need to understand different techniques such as off-site manufacture or prefabrication or other techniques which actually might drive that. We need to make sure we look at existing buildings. If we look at the carbon targets that will be coming out of COP21 and the wider conversation we're having anyway, it isn't the new buildings which will drive that agenda, it's our existing buildings. We need to understand how we can improve those. And as part of the Drivers of the Future, we need to understand how BIM and FIM, or Facilities Information Modelling, will actually drive this agenda to make quicker decisions, to share that information between design professionals much more effectively. We need to make sure that we're working in much more integrated ways. If we look at some of the design professionals, we work in silos. If we're going to actually drive this agenda, we need to make sure that we actually are much more integrated than our people. And those innovation cycles need to happen quicker. We need to make sure that we look at other industries. Some of the technology insertion is much, much quicker than is in the construction industry. You just look at the mobile phone in your pocket, it changes rapidly every 6 months. Some of the technologies we see in our buildings don't move at the same pace. We need to think about that. And as I said before, each one of those present opportunities. And that narrative up to this point is saying that if we understand the trends in terms of where the industry is going, it helps the certification systems, it helps the industry, it helps me to push you, to drive you, because in essence, all green is a scorecard of best practice. And I speak in lots of different countries, I talk to lots of different people throughout the world, and it's great because all I do is I hand-pick best practice worldwide. I talk to my team back in the office and we research it, and all we then do is share that best practice to help and support people to do better. That's all rating systems are, is best practice to help and support people to inspire them. Basically what slide says, I suppose. And I think what's equally important, if you look at what we're trying to do, this isn't about imposing ideas. This is about working within the brain of knowledge and skills and your own standards in a particular country. And one of the unique things, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute, but one of the unique things that we try and do really is understand what the regulatory base is and work from that rather than trying to impose regulations in other countries on them. And in that same conversation, if we're going to drive change, it's about making sure that customers feel valued, it's about making sure that the certification systems that we work to give you that confidence in terms of what's happening in the particular market, grow and change as well. And it's about sharing that information. One of the things that we're doing more and more, as we collect information for the certification of buildings, it's about providing that information back to them. So how many tons of carbon are saved in buildings in this country? How many tons of carbon are saved in other countries? So we can start to see what the impact that is. We can understand that information, how we can turn that back into knowledge and best practice again. So, just kind of looking at green in a little bit more detail in terms of responding to some of those challenges. So, one of the things which I think is incredibly important, as we talked about some of that best practice stuff already, is making sure this agenda continues to evolve. So if I look back to green in version 1, which was 25 years ago, it was very much about some of the environmental issues. What we've done more recently is we've actually made sure that we are actually embracing many of these social issues as well, making sure we're driving best practice, not just from an environmental perspective, but sustainability really does embrace that economic, social, environmental. And it's about making sure that we innovate. You know, it's very evident that every country in this conversation about sustainability will have a different perspective. And it's about creating rating tools and systems that create this space to allow people to innovate. And that's one of the fundamentals of green, is making sure that we're not restricting people, we're enabling you to think about how you can design better buildings. We're sharing with you our best practice across a whole number of areas, but we're also giving you space to be creative in terms of what we're designing inside. And as part of that journey over the last 25 years, we started with new construction. But what became very evident more recently is, as you start to look at different scales of construction, you get different advantages. So if you start to look at large-scale master planning, you can make some very clever, sophisticated decisions around maybe CHP, combined heat and power networks, which has the advantage of giving you more stable energy models, but it also gives you opportunities to actually achieve lower carbon development, because you can push the fabric of the building so far. But when it comes to some of the energy solutions, maybe some of those energy solutions are not looking at the local, but actually looking at networks in terms of providing that opportunity. So it's about now connecting across the scale of the building. It's about understanding the life cycle, so everybody can actually improve their building. I've got a few examples in terms of the existing buildings are really driving that change. So starting to look at some of our schemes, One of the things which is very evident, probably in our more recent history in terms of master planning, is we've actually not sort of built communities, we've constructed them out of concrete and brick. And one of the important issues, if we're going to try and change, particularly on the social agenda, is to make sure that we really understand how communities work. You know, communities are very dynamic, they're very organic entities. You can't force things. You need to understand how those communities work. And so when you integrate new communities and existing communities together, you really need to get them to work effectively. So our community scheme is very much about ensuring that we really look at some of that large-scale design, making sure that we engage stakeholders, understand how community will work, making sure that it really understands that sort of dynamic nature of the community. And this is a little bit of slide put in. This is an example of the development we're working on at the moment, where it's very much centred around the retail development with lots of car parking spaces. And as a consequence of that town centre became very, very cluttered, because it really hadn't thought about the mixed-use development and making sure that to make that community vibrant was about really redesigning some of the thinking and making sure that you can actually allow people to take modes of transport and actually get that mixed-use feeling in that space, which then creates a much more dynamic community, a much more vibrant community. It's also about making sure that at a building level you integrate it to a community scale as well. So making sure that the building and the community assessments work really well together. And those elements are basically some of the governance models that we, or some of the elements that actually go into the assessment process. We've added infrastructure in terms of our scheme. It's been launched this week, but once again it's about making sure that when we start to look at investment models, we don't stop at the building level, we don't stop at the community level. There's a large amount of investment going into infrastructure. We need to make sure that infrastructure is really resilient and looking forward in terms of growth for the future. So when you start to look at some of the categories that we assess our buildings against or our developments against, we're now adding resilience, we're now adding stakeholders, we're also adding the local well-being, because as you build some of that large-scale infrastructure, you want to make sure you don't have any unintended consequences in terms of what might impact on our local groups. I mentioned before as well that one of the essential agreements of what we do in green is about making sure we work with you at the local level. It's one of the unique things that we do in green. And so we have a series of actual local standards. We have a local weighting, so the way you might look at issues here will be very, very different from the way you might look at things in the Middle East or in South America. So the sensitivity of your stresses and strains on your built environment and your social and environmental environment needs to be reflected as well. Just an example of what we call the 18 checklist, which is about building more local standards into the scheme that we've created. That results in our international scheme. It looks across all of the various types of buildings that can be assessed. So in essence, we can look at offices and retail and all those types of development. And it all comes together, so one single standard drives multiple outcomes. So I just wanted to throw you a couple of examples here. So if I look at a building in Belgium, that one standard drove a building which was basically looking at how you could drive an excellent, outstanding building, and effectively it looked at CHP as the way it was going to drive its energy solution. It drove its fabric solution, it looked at how it was going to achieve it, but it's part of a wider community. So they saw the best solution was look at CHP. If I look at another development, they were looking at a very different solution. They looked at how they could make the building as efficient as possible. They then added renewables in terms of photovoltaics and other services that building. So one standard doesn't control how you design a building or even the solutions you design. It's there to inspire. It's there to make sure that the standard that this creates supports you to do the best you can. But what I wanted to just share with you as well is it's not just about the building, it is about the business model. So going back to those earlier slides, If I take a building in Manchester, this was the Co-op building in Manchester, we had a long conversation with them because they wanted to be the most sustainable building in the world. That was the target they set themselves for. And we were down to the detail of not just talking about how they were going to design the building, what facilities they were going to place in the building, but also how they were going to power it. So they were talking about buying a renewable farm to grow crops to create biofuels. And we said, well, that's great, but your supermarket, you actually have waste oils from the cooking you do in your supermarket. Why don't you use the waste oil to power your offices? And that's the solution they came up with. Not just looking at the level of detail in terms of the building itself, but the actual supply chain support. But it's not just about new construction. You know, if we go back to that earlier slide in terms of some of the drivers, some of our existing buildings have a large way to improve. And so we have a number of schemes which are there to design to support, to drive existing buildings. And if I take an example as well, a case study, just to kind of give you a feeling of what that looks like. This is a building in France. When they first occupied the building, they were operating at 150 kilowatts hours per square metre per year. Over the last few years, they've driven performance down to about 60. And that's looking at the energy efficiency of the building, it's looking at the design of the building. Now they're into the space at 60, where they're actually looking at the renewable energy and actually generating energy. So when it comes to making sure our buildings are as sustainable as possible, the new construction process is easy. We're constantly improving, we're constantly learning. Starting from a blank piece of paper is an easy challenge. People who actually drive fabric and solutions and products and services of existing buildings are not belong to me. In that same conversation as well, we've now done a lot of work in terms of looking at refurbishment fit out. You know, if we look at how we design our buildings and we take the information from buildings in operation, we have a massive opportunity here to drive it. We took it out of our existing new construction scheme, and now we've actually created our own process to look at the design and the fit out or the refurbishment of existing buildings. One of the biggest challenges was to make sure that we could provide a scheme that not work just only work with buildings which are reasonable, but also historic buildings as well, because you have cavity walls, you have solid walls. How do we make sure that as we create schemes, we don't actually solve one problem in terms of efficiency and create a health problem in terms of moisture or growth issues which will result. So I think we've achieved that scheme. And that's broken down into 4 parts. It's looking at the fabric, looking at the structure, local and core services. So you can adapt the assessment based on how you are going to actually refurbish your building. So it's a flexible scheme. And this comes back to one of my earlier slides. If we're going to drive change, it's about making sure the schemes, the standards that we create are flexible and adaptable to support that process. And behind all the work that VRA does, the research-based charity, we sponsor 6 universities, we've currently got about 150 PhDs. Behind that, it gives us the opportunity to really support the research that drives this process. And a good example of that is we've done some research going back to our existing buildings and making sure that we see good return on investment. So when we start to look at some of our buildings, we're seeing a payback for some of that technology 2 to 5 years, which basically means that sometimes people think the return on investment is quite a long period, but actually you can see some really tangible benefits. So what I wanted to try and do is talk you through my 4 objectives. I wanted to say to you, you've got some really exciting times here. VRE and Dream is here to help you and support you in that process. That first slide is my last one, but I lied a little bit. Because I think the last slide needs to be, it isn't just about this, it's about how you as individuals and professionals can move in terms of how you want to address that challenge. So thank you.
Collected most of the likes. So the question is, how exactly does DREAM adjust to local regulations? In what ways? So if you could elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. So, as I mentioned in the presentation, we try and take one international standard, which is basically what is the best practice across the world, across the number of issues. And then what we do is we look at the regulation in a particular country, we take that as our baseline, and it's about how can we improve above the regulatory baselines. We won't reward you for what we should be doing for regulation in the country, but what we try and do then is support you in terms of what is best practice beyond your regulatory baseline. How can we help you, support you to do better? And in certain instances where you don't have a regulation to look at a particular issue, we will support you by taking an international best practice and saying that you're looking at, say, for instance, commissioning a building and you don't have a regulation to look at that. This is best practice worldwide. Consider using this as your standard, and then that's how to do it.
I think that's good. Thank you. So thanks again for the presentation.